Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of the Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario, and online experiences to anyone in this mortal realm. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and we thank you for joining us for this episode. Last week, we shared with you the first half of our interview with Dr. Irving Finkel, the British Museum's assistant keeper of ancient Mesopotamian script, languages, and cultures. He explained that the earliest written records in human history, ancient clay cuneiform tablets, contain extensive and detailed mentions of ghosts. In fact, in his recent book, First Ghosts, Most Ancient of Legacies, he states that ghosts were so accepted and expected in Mesopotamian culture that the existence of those who have returned from the other side would have been taken for granted. Families had the responsibility of carrying out rituals that would allow the soul of their loved one to leave the mortal body and depart for the netherworld, where hopefully it would stay. If the rituals were carried out incorrectly, or the offerings insufficient, the resentful spirits of these family members would return to cause trouble. For those that died in more tragic circumstances, or had no family to care for them, they would often attach themselves to random people, who would have to undergo a variety of tasks to try to free themselves from their paranormal stalker. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I would strongly recommend listening to it first, as my modest description here does not do it justice. Today, in part 2 of our interview, Dr. Finkel shares more from his book, including a discussion of the earliest drawing of a ghost, which you can find a link to in our show notes, the intricate role of exorcists in ancient societies, and how the dead would often be rudely called up from the underworld to answer pressing personal questions from the living. But before we get to that, a very happy May 24 to many of our Canadian listeners. For the long weekend, we have all sorts of ghost tours running in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, and we would love for you to join us for a night of chilling stories and strange tales. This week, we were thrilled to announce our 2022 lineup of paranormal investigations with our good friends from Phantoms of Yore, taking place at several spooky haunted heritage sites in Eastern Ontario, including old jails, mills, and manor houses. These events are extremely fun, fascinating, and completely unpredictable. Just like you see on paranormal shows, you get decked out with all the latest ghost hunting gear, and then are set loose in the dark to see what you can discover. With the small group sizes, these always sell out well in advance, so be sure to book yourself in early to avoid disappointment. Information and tickets for our ghost tours and paranormal investigations can be found on our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. Thank you to everyone for the kind compliments on our new Haunted Talks logo. A quick reminder, we now have Haunted Talks tees and hoodies available on our website, and until the end of May, you can get 10% off by using the promo code Haunted Talks, all one word, at checkout. Look spooky and help support the show. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk, for the latest news, updates, and silly ghost memes. Two easy and helpful ways you can let us know you're out there and enjoying the show is to write us a 5-star review wherever you listen, and to recommend Haunted Talks to friends, family, random strangers on the internet, or anyone you think would enjoy it.
This book's called The First Ghosts, the world's oldest legacy. I tell you why I'd like people to read this book, because I want people to know about ancient Mesopotamia, and they often don't. And I think it's quite interesting that all the books about ghosts never start with that. They start maybe with the Greeks, and then the Middle Ages, and then all the other stuff. But actually the story begins right at the beginning of writing. And so it puts a kind of new perspective on the narrative.
In addition to the first written account of ghosts, the cuneiform tablets also contain some of the first image of a ghost. And I'll drop a link to that in the show notes so people can take a look for themselves. And I must admit, before looking at the picture myself, I had some fun imagining a sheet ghost, floating around on these ancient artifacts. Yes. Of course, that's not the case, but Irving, could you explain the scene for that particular scene that is depicted, which may be the first ghost recorded in that way?
I think I claim it to be the oldest drawing of a ghost. And it is a very exciting thing, because when I decided to write this book, I looked all through our collection, which is so large, looking for cuneiform inscriptions that had something to do with ghost stuff. I had a sort of fat notebook. And then when I started to write the book, I went through them all carefully. And when I got to this particular tablet, I had a big shock, because it was written in the 4th century BC, 300 and some. And it was from Babylon, the city of Babylon. The front of the tablet has on it a long description in Babylonian for the manufacture of a figurine of a ghost and of a woman. And the situation is clearly this, that there'd been a trouble in the family with some old ghost who was coming back and getting on people's nerves. So the exorcist who came in, the man who'd read all the omens and knew all the rituals, in a case like this would probably interview the person who'd seen the ghost with the hope that they could pin down who it might be. Because if you can identify the ghost and you know the name of the ghost as a result, you have much more chance of sending it back quickly. And in this case, what must have happened is an old man in the family, probably a grandfather or something, was coming back. And what they discovered about this grandfather is he was always rather fond of female company. And they reckoned that his malaise in the netherworld was a persistent interest in that sort of thing. The decision made by the exorcist was this, that perhaps we better give this grandfather or great-grandfather what he needs, and then the problem will go. So this was the conception, that you made out of clay a figure perhaps 4 inches high, showing the ghost, who was male and everything, obviously. And then you have to make a similar thing out of clay of a rather voluptuous woman. And then when the clay was dry, they were dressed in the right clothes, which is described in the ritual, with a girded kind of dressing gown affair, and she has a necklace and shoes. And the two things are put into a pit at sunset with food and provisions, and this woman is supposed to lead the grandfather back down to the underworld, where they live happily ever after. The use of figurines of this kind is rather commonplace, but what makes the tablet that you mentioned so remarkable is that the exorcist who wrote the instructions made drawings of the figure of the ghost and of this woman, this seductive, irresistible female. And he drew them in the clay with a fine point and a great deal of authority. The ghost is shown as a tall, thin man with a straggly beard, wearing a sort of dressing gown affair, and his hands are stretched in front of him and they are bound together. And he is walking some paces behind this lady who has a straight back, rather curvaceous form, walking with a great deal of rigour. And the thing which binds his hands together is a rope, the other end of which she is shown in the drawing, she is holding. So she is going to take him down to the netherworld with no chance of escape. The drawings are not sort of sketchy things that you might do to amuse children. They are actually anatomically very accurate representations of the human form, done with a high level of artistry. And the drawings are spectacular. They're very faint. So in the book, there's a photograph of this tablet, and then my colleague Jamie, who's a computer wizard, blocked in white the lines of the ghost and the lady, the courtesan, shall we say, so that they can be clearly seen. And they're walking along together, she leading him off. It is the most spectacular thing. And of course, I, quite reasonably, I think, claimed at the time, this must be the oldest drawing of a ghost in the world, because where are you going to find an earlier one? I mean, hello, where would you begin? This tablet with this first picture of a ghost is going to be in the next edition of the Guinness Book of Records.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, the director of the whole affair came to see me. We showed him the tablet. We showed him all about it, gave him the book. He had a good think, and he agreed this is the oldest drawing of a ghost in the world. And we have a certificate to this effect. So next Christmas, if you get the Guinness Book of Records, leaf through, ignore Mount Everest and sports records and how many boiled eggs could be eaten by a single human being. Irrelevant. This ghost is now going to be famous. So it is remarkable. And when you look at it, and when you think about the mechanism, to our mind, it's a bit comic. But actually, it's not comic, it's sympathetic. They're doing their best to analyse what the ghost needs and to give it to the ghost. So the ghost goes away and everybody is happy. It's a kind of high-level negotiation, the sort of negotiation where all parties are happy, which we could do more use with in the modern world than we often can. You know what I mean? And when you look at the tablet at first, it looks like nothing. But when your eye accustoms to it, and you can see it is the most spectacular thing in the world. The wonderful thing also is that the drawing is so skillful. Because you know how it is if you try and draw a back end of a horse with a pencil. Unless you're a draftsman or an artist, you never get it right. And you kind of rub a bit out. And you can't do that on clay. You have to get it right first time. Otherwise, it's all screwed up. And it's perfect. It's such an amazing thing. I always think of this stuff like cuneiform tablets and the life that they contain, like windows that you can look in or over someone's shoulder just for a minute in their lives and what they thought and what they felt. And the ghost material is very choice and rich from this point of view. But actually, that drawing is something else. It's just amazing, I think.
It feels like there's something very poetic as well about this drawing of a ghost that, like a ghost, has returned or re-emerged 3,000-4,000 years later is something very poetic as well. Is that your first connection to the Guinness Book of World Records, or any other notable entries?
No, I've never, not in the least. I think it would be quite a feat to get in it for two different things. But I mean, a friend of mine who suggested it for fun, and they thought it was a really good idea. And when they saw it, they agreed definitely. So we actually have in our department a framed certificate. I'm very proud of it.
A term you did mention there, which would probably register with our listeners, is the term exorcist, which I think a lot of people relate mostly to the classic horror film more than anything else. And maybe using that as a template of kind of religious power, the spirit of Christ compels you, those kind of images. How would the exorcists in Mesopotamia differ, I guess, in their approach and practice? You mentioned the figurines and creating kind of objects being involved in some of the ritual, but could you expand on that a little bit for us about the exorcist?
Certainly. I mean, if you've seen the Exorcist film, you have a specific view of all these things. But of course, the Exorcist in that film was a venerable Roman Catholic priest who, as part of his training, I don't know if it's still the case, but it wasn't until quite recently that Roman Catholic priests knew how to drive out demons in people's houses. It is part of their knowledge. And I know people who've actually had this experience that a priest has come to the house and done some cleansing ritual under such circumstances. So it's not dead, even like that. Well, the exorcists in Mesopotamia, it is indeed a loaded word. They were the people who knew how to identify and drive out ghosts and demons. there were two basic forms of evil. So the ghosts are dead persons, and they are not as inimical as demons, although sometimes they could be very nasty. They're not so dangerous. Demons are a whole different kettle of fish because they have no human component. So they are merciless, and they are not susceptible to wooing or sweet talk, and they are immortal. So demons are a whole factor of 100 more dangerous than ghosts are, even though there are some horrible ghosts. So the exorcists who did this, they were in a sense professional because they had their own literature, their own rituals, and their own training, and they were called in. Your normal exorcist had a kind of bag of spells for all sorts of occasions, and some were specialists and some were generalists. The devices which were available to an exorcist in that culture to get rid of a demon or to get rid of a ghost, they would have amulets, and they would have spells with magic words in, and they would have rituals of greater or lesser complexity, and all three things were possible. They had amulets, sometimes of hard stone, to be worn on the neck, which would repel a demon or a ghost because of the force of the spell. Amulets are a kind of general thing in the world, and the Mesopotamian ones are very similar to other sorts of amulets of the kind. For example, there are Jewish and Muslim stone amulets with lines from the Quran or the Bible with the letters all mixed up as magic words to drive things away or clean the house. And the principles of those magic words and magic signs and powerful names go back to the Mesopotamian principle. It's a common human thing. So amulets could be cheap, they could be expensive. Then there were recitations where you had these spells that could be declared either by the exorcist, who probably had a very good line in pronouncing the words in a very forbidding way. You know, get thee from my house and all this kind of thing. Bye, so-and-so, bye, so-and-so. And go, okay, I'm going, something like that. And also, one or two of the spells are a bit comic, really, because you get the impression that the person who's seen the ghost, it's not only that they've seen them and they come back, but the ghosts are trying to make them go with them, as if they're going with their bony finger, like, you come with me, you follow me. And the guy says, I'm not going with you, I'm not going, I'm just not going. And he calls on all these goddesses to tell them off, including the lady who keeps the record of who's in and out of the underworld, to kind of mark him as if he's, not where he's supposed to be, not clocked in or something like that. There are touches of rather endearing simplicity of idea, but they're quite remarkable. So you have these magic words, and you have threats, and you have bribes, because the sun god had lots of responsibilities, and one of them was administering the underworld, because when the sun set at night, it went under the world and then came up the next day through the gates. So while down there, the sun god was supposed to regulate everything among the ghosts and make sure everything was fine. And when ghosts got out and were upstairs in the world, often the sufferer would appeal to Shamash to intervene and take these ghosts. But I promised to do these offerings which I haven't done. I would pour these every day, and so we'll do it for my cousins, and all this kind of flattery like that. And then they sometimes have a little bribe for Shamash as well, a small bundle of jewels or something, just to sweeten the sun god. There's a law case where they have to appeal to the sun god to intervene because they've been unjustly molested by the ghosts, and the ghosts are then told to go away by the sun god, who's won over by your barrister kind of narrative. So there's a whole range of different things like this, and then simple rituals and then complicated rituals, and the one with the drawing is one of the more complicated ones, and no doubt more expensive.
Just to bring us into a slightly different topic, we've kind of been discussing when ghosts have shown up unexpectedly or unannounced. But of course, there were cases where Mesopotamians were trying to contact the dead. And your chapter, I believe, is called The Delicate Art of Necromancy, which you describe as summoning the dead to get information or prophecy about the future, which very much reminded me of kind of a Victorian seance to some degree. What kinds of information were Mesopotamians trying to extract from the dead? How did the dead convey that information? And do we know how the dead felt about kind of being drawn up from their contented life in the underworld to kind of answer these vigorous questions?
Well, I like these questions. They're good questions, and quite frankly, it's impossible to answer them. One of the problems is we have some rituals for getting a ghost to come and answer questions. And the result of it, of course, an exorcist or a professional ghost handler, so to speak, has to run the operation. The skull is probably of the person in question is the medium, and the dead person is summoned by Shamash, the sun god, to come up and get into the skull. And then it says in Babylonian, Mimma tashalushu ikkabika, whatever you ask him, he will tell you. So we know that the result of the ritual is to bring up possibly a reluctant ghost from below, possibly into his own skull, we don't know that even, and then to be coerced by a very powerful spell or two into answering questions. That's all we know. So we don't know whether somebody wanted to know who is going to win the Grand National, or whether his wife was faithful, or whether this or whether that. We don't know any of the questions that were asked. It's just the procedure to get the thing into a position where you can ask questions. I try to imagine myself how this would be. I think it would be exceptionally frightening, however cool you were, to be in a room with a professional exorcist who probably wore grotesque clothing with things stuck in a belt and things around his neck, and like some Californian from 1968, with lots of incense and all this kind of stuff and sonorous thing. And the skull is there, and your voice probably wouldn't work. And then if you ask a question and then the voice came out of the skull, you probably have a heart attack. I mean, it must be a very, very stressful thing. So it wasn't done frivolously, that you can be sure of. And if it were done, I imagine it was something of great gravity for the persons involved. I could imagine infidelity or am I the father of my son type questions being one category, another one being where did my auntie bury all the gold? And those sorts of questions, because they're the most plausible. But unfortunately, we don't have a tablet which has any of this information on it. It is the most interesting information. Let's say, for example, you have a real problem and you really decide to do this, and you get this chap to bring the ghost up, and the ghost is there. And you're, why is it the case, and it's not only in Mesopotamia, but in all the cultures of the world where necromancy of any kind is practiced, which is quite widespread, why is there the underpinning idea that the ghost is going to tell you the truth? Why, A, does the ghost know the future about everything? I'm not sure that they would. Everything, the weather maybe, but I mean, really? And secondly, if they did know a specific thing, maybe they wouldn't tell you, or maybe they would tell you a lie. I mean, there are all these pitfalls because people, on the whole, often do tell lies. It's a bit of a strange thing. One of the amusing side of this necromancy matter is when the skull has spoken, and if you imagine, voice coming out like that, there's lots of jolly good banging nails firmly into the matter to get him to go back. Because the last thing you want to do is get this ghost floating around the house and going out the window and then causing God knows what trouble. So they have to have the thing really under control so that once the back down again you go. There's a later one, which is the same sort of thing, where it looks like somebody is asking whether such and such a woman is in love with him, or whether he's likely to be successful in gaining her love. And I think that might be right, because it's near the time of Greek in Babylonia. And the thing is, there's lots of Greek papyri of the end of the first millennium, the beginning of the first millennium AD, around this time, Greek magic spells, which are like that. They're all about that kind of thing. You go and see someone to find out whether this woman will love you and what you do to win her love, and you write things on things. So in the beginning of the Greek magic tradition, private questions about love are commonplace. So it seems to me quite likely that the last ones in Mesopotamia, which we have a glimpse, might also be not so serious, but just for the person, to find out whether they're going to be successful in love. It is the most spectacular thing when there's a mountain of literature to not see ghosts, to get rid of ghosts, to drive them back, to countermand all the horrible implications of seeing a ghost, which sometimes are very gruesome. And then, next minute, calling one up. So they ring the doorbell and in they come. I mean, it's quite an astonishing thing, but we know about it. And of course, there's that thing in the Bible, you remember, the Witch of Endor. And you know what you were saying about the ghost being reluctant? Well, when Saul decides he has to find out whether the Philistines are going to defeat him, and the Lord, as they put it in the Bible, will not tell him, he decides he has to speak to the dead prophet Samuel. So he goes up the mountain to where this woman, the place called Endor, and he commissions her to bring up Samuel, the prophet who died fairly recently, to answer his question. Well, she does it, and Samuel comes up. And the first thing he says, this prophet, is, "Why have you disturbed me?" And when you read it in the Hebrew text or in the translation, it is absolutely something to make the hair stand up on the back of your neck, because it is absolutely realistic. Samuel, you get the impression, was lounging around on a sofa with a beer watching baseball, and the doorbell rings and he has to get up and he has to go, and he has to go all the way up to it's the last thing he wants to do. So why have you disturbed me? It says it is hilarious when you think of it like that. And the whole thing, which is read from pulpits as part of Holy Writ, the way it's described is riveting, because it is the same as Mesopotamia. It is the same idea. And he asks him questions and he says, "You've had it. It's all over with you." And he goes back down into the netherworld. And Saul, who can hardly stand for fear and trembling, and his assistants are about to go down the mountain, and the so-called Witch of Endor, before they go, makes them a hot meal. She won't let them go without having something to eat. I mean, if that isn't credible, you just have to read that story to yourself. It is astonishing. But the working of the idea is the same, I think, as the Mesopotamian one. There, it was the fate of Saul's monarchy and the whole dynasty, and I mean, that was a massively grave thing. And that would drive him to take recourse to necromancy.
After finishing your research and writing the book, did you find it changed the way you think about ghosts in your own life? And that could be both in your professional context as a historian or a researcher, but also in your personal life as a mortal entity walking around the earth. Has this book left you with any kind of long-standing questions or a different mindset by which you're kind of experiencing the world?
In a way, no, because I've always been interested in ghosts. And at the beginning of the book, I described how a friend of mine at school saw one when we were very young, and his description had been with me all this time. So the lingering background situation for the whole of my, was it then 68 years, had been a slight sense of disappointment that I'd never seen a ghost. That's been the itch with me, that I've never seen a ghost, even though I've tried a few times. I'm not an agnostic. I have much more sympathy with people who have had such an experience and don't talk about it, because I know how much more common that is. You know, when I was writing this book, there's a thing called the Psychic Society in London, which was founded by had people like Conan Doyle on it. You know, I mean, a serious heavyweight institution. They had this Victorian library. They asked me to give a lecture there one evening. So I was talking about the stuff that I'm working on and everything like that. And I said that, you know, when you investigate literature all over the world, as far back as you can, everybody records stories about seeing ghosts, and the stories are very comparable from all over the place. And it adds up to the most amazing quantity of evidence, except scientists don't think it's evidence, but it's not meant to be evidence. It's just meant to be narrative and account. And I said that, you know, I thought that the whole question of ghosts should be regarded with a lot more sympathy and balance than it often is. And then the chairman stood up and said, "Well, very interesting lecture. Of course, you're preaching to the converted here, because we've all seen ghosts many times," he said. So I was the only one in the room who hadn't. There are places in the British Museum, which is, of course, full of bodies and all manner of hidden crime, where you might think ghosts are to be seen. And there are many people who have seen ghosts in the British Museum, many of them except me. In a facetious thing in the book, I had this idea, which I think is, I stick by it. In all religions of the world, as far as I know, the clergy will tell you when there's a death that little Johnny is up in heaven and is safe, and his spirit is with the Almighty, or things of this kind. And that simple statement reflects an entire religious system on the globe, that when the body is gone, something comes out and goes somewhere. This is a universally held belief. And, for example, Christian theologians will refer to it very commonly in pastoral work in a family where there's been a deceased. So the thing is, the same person with the same breath might then say, well, I hope he doesn't come back and haunt the house. Well, you don't believe ghosts, that's just a load of old nonsense. So it is possible for someone to believe firmly that an invisible part of a human being comes out at the last moment and goes somewhere, and disbelieve in ghosts. Well, in my opinion, they are the same thing. And this, I think, is a very simple solution to a lot of dispute. Because when I was a boy, actually, it always fascinated me because I'm Jewish and I went to a normal school with Christian things, and there was an assembly every morning, and the headmaster used to refer to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And all my life I've wondered what a Holy Ghost was. I've always found that a very interesting idea. In any case, I discovered in writing this book that on the radio, when they have church services on the BBC, the clergymen say the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So there's been a shift, proving to me, in a legal way, that the ghost and the spirit are the same thing. So what is the difference between a Babylonian ghost and a Christian spirit? Simply this, that the ghost is sometimes, to some people, visible. And that is the only difference. And I account for the fact that lots of people don't see them, not in a scientific way, but I wonder, for example, whether this might not be the truth, that you have people who are colorblind and people who are tone deaf. And maybe it is such that the capacity, some people sense something, some people won't go in a room because there's something, and some people see ghosts. And it may be that there is a receptor of different strengths in different people's minds. And if this is true, the beauty about this, it means that nobody's telling a lie. All narratives are reconcilable. Nobody is telling a lie. Now, would that not be a masterpiece of procedure? But there's something to it. There's something to it. We have a Victorian library in my department of the Middle East, 3 towering levels of books and journals with iron staircases. It's a very, very beautiful building in there, 1840. And in the evening when it's dark, it is really quite marvellous. And lots of people have seen a ghost on the upper 3rd floor. Lots of people over the years. And I've been up there sometimes in the evening, in the dark, and kept very still and hoped for the best. Zilch. Drives me mad. It drives me mad. I will be so interested. I really would. But what can you do? I think if you have this conception, then you can exclude all the people who tell lies and the people who try to make money out of things and force reports and all this and all this. But the narrative among normal people is overwhelming in its size. And you cannot really dismiss it. So I think it's much more sensible to look at things in a sympathetic way. And the thing about the Babylonians is they are right at the beginning of the story, as far as we can go, because we have the writing. And that is so fantastic. It really is so fantastic.
I think that's a great place to to wrap things up. Irving Finkel, thank you so much for making the time to speak with us. And as you've been mentioning, in our line of work, we run into all sorts of people with a lot of beliefs. And, sometimes when we reach out for guests to be on the podcast or whatever, particularly if they fall in scientific or historical circles, there will often be a great deal of reluctance talk and to share information and that kind of thing. So I really appreciate where you were coming from with this book. I love the concept of kind of democratizing ghost stories or reconciling the narratives, I think is the way you put it. But please let us know if you ever do have a sighting at the museum there, because we would love to hear all about it.
You can be entirely certain. It's lovely to talk to you. Be well.
A very special thank you to Dr. Irving Finkel for being so generous with his time and joining us over the last 2 episodes. One of my favorite parts of hosting Haunted Talks is getting to share interesting and knowledgeable people with you, and I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did. His book again, which I highly recommend, is First Ghosts, Most Ancient of Legacies. And, of course, thank you for joining us. For information about our ghost tours, paranormal investigations, and new Haunted Talks tees and hoodies, please visit our website, hauntedwalk.com. There, you can also find information on our virtual experiences, including our haunted campfires and the haunting at home, all of which can be enjoyed from anywhere in the world. As always, a heartfelt thank you to our hard-working Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor. Until we meet again, have a wonderful long weekend and sweet dreams.